We're back together again. I had a vacation last week, and so we're going to try and catch up. We're adjusting things now, and I think we're just about ready. You know, it's a long, long time since World War II and victory in Europe. And so I thought we would try and put it into 1 hour. And it's easy to do if you pay attention to the mainstream. There was first the Battle of the Sky. And without that battle being won, and it was won by the British, there was no possibility of a victory in Europe. After that, the Italians, unfortunately with Mussolini in the lead, led a charge into North Africa. And there was a Battle of the Sand. And then when that was completely Kabbalics, we had the Battle of the Snow, which is the battle in Russia. And then when we had to go and think about getting us involved, we had the Battle of the Sea, that is the battle of winning the war against the U-boats. And then we had the Battle of the Shore, which is Normandy. And if you get those 5 right, you've got the battles that make up the major part of the war. Now, there are lots of other things that occur. There's this silly man who is the Prince of Wales, going to marry this woman come hell or high water. And so you have a major constitutional crisis in which he decides to give up the throne for the woman he loves. Many people thought that was very romantic. I thought it was rather stupid. But it was what the Windsors are famous for doing. But we aren't going to pay attention to this. Today we're going to pay attention to some very key people. One of the key people is Lord Beaverbrook. And what did Beaverbrook do? Well, Beaverbrook saw the war coming and knew that Britain was not prepared and therefore worked day and night to give Britain the great machinery of war, which was the Spitfire, which was basically a fighter that could really fight. And going up against it was a fighter that couldn't fight. And it was the Messerschmitt 100. Messerschmitt is still a famous name in Deutschland. The best airplane built in the world today is the Airbus. And the Airbus has a total package, an avionics package from Messerschmitt's. So a German name lives on long after the war and creates 10,000 high-tech jobs in Toulouse to give us this huge and successful airplane. Once it had been Boeing's day in the sun. Now, of course, Boeing has had a tragedy and is losing as opposed to winning, but that's another story. What we do know is that with Beaverbrook giving us an airplane that could fight and could fight in the most unbelievable way, the airplane, the Spitfire, could hide out in a barn. So it could be scattered over the landscape of Britain and not on any hard surface. It could land and take off from a basic field that in other terms would be a farmyard. So therefore they could be scattered everywhere and they could be called upon to go to a special place and to fight with the Messerschmitts. And that's in fact what they did. In the Battle of Britain, the Battle of the Sky, Britain was able to bring forward an airframe that was tremendously successful. It had time on target. It could not only fight over Britain, it could fight in the south of Britain in particular, and it could fight across the channel, something the Messerschmitt could not do. The Messerschmitt was a perfectly designed airplane designed for close air support because the German military, the senior service was the Army. And in the Army, the senior service was the Tank Corps, the Panzers. And therefore, they cared less about, and they assigned to the Doomkopf in charge of the Luftwaffe was Göring. Now, Göring had been an air ace in World War I, but he was quite young. But by the time he was in World War II and he was in charge of the Luftwaffe, he was a cocaine addict. And not only that, he was then enthralled with a Swedish blonde, and he planned to marry her and live with her in Sweden. So they did not portend well for the Luftwaffe. Poor leadership and a group of people who were attracted to another system. The people who were in charge of the German military were brilliant. The one that comes to mind and who was voted by his own constabulary as the best German general of World War II, General von Manstein, did all he could to help Germany win the war, but it wasn't to be. So you have this first big battle, rages all over Britain. You have the airplanes scattered all over the place so that they cannot be easily found. You find that the people in charge are, well, let me put it this way. The British were very smart at bringing the empire to work so that the man in charge of Bomber Command was a South African, not an Englishman. And the man in charge, whose name was Harris, and the man in charge of Fighter Command was a New Zealander. So you have these people from all over the empire coming to fight for Britain and giving her the extra hand up. And with Beaverbrook quickly organizing the British Royal Air Force, they were prepared to fight the Battle of the Sky and fight it successfully. And once they did that, it assured, since nothing else was sure, that they would be able to fight on until the Americans joined. Remember, we are very late again in joining this particular world war. But we did come. And we came by a recent date in infamy. If you remember that this is December, and there was a strike at Pearl Harbor in which we lost our battlefield. And with that, we came into the war. And so we had to spend time catching up, while the British had spent a lot of time already fighting and holding the line. There was a woman in Britain, Vida Saxwell West. She had the most beautiful garden in all of Britain. I know you don't think that's important, but to the British, gardens are really important. And her garden was at Sissinghurst. And she used to sit in the garden with her husband, an ambassador, and her lover occasionally, who was a woman. So it was a little tete-a-tete between Virginia Woolf and Vida Saxwell West. But the important thing was that they'd sit in the garden at Sissinghurst, in the White Garden, and watch the dogfights between the Messerschmitts and uh, the British planes. And what they would get out of this was that the Messerschmitts had to run back to Germany, or at least to France, to get refueled. So it turned out to be a very bad situation for the German command. And then, as fate would have it, Mussolini decided that he needed to get into the war. So he decided to attack in the Battle of the Sand into North Africa, into Libya. Libya is a thin line across the Mediterranean, and a line that 99% of Libya is sand, and the little tiny bit that isn't is the strip along the coast. But Mussolini, determined to play a role in this war, had invaded Libya and then turned his attention to Egypt because he thought he could recreate the Roman Empire. Unfortunately, there was a British army, the famous British Eighth Army, and it was the only land army that Britain had at the time, and it was in Egypt. And so you have this enormous clash, and the Italians are defeated. And the English do not stay. They follow the Italians back across the Egyptian desert into Libya. And so at that point in time, Herr Hitler decides he has to save Mussolini. So he sends in this magnificent general, and he leads a small armored group of panzers. They're called the Afrika Corps. And this is not a Prussian general. This is a man from Stuttgart who is going to make a name for himself and finally have to commit suicide to please Herr Hitler, because it was true that the Desert Fox knew about the plot to kill Hitler in the Wolf's Lair later in the war. But for right now, we're in the desert, and perhaps you don't know this, most people don't. We are about to come in the war, and we are going to locate ourselves initially, Eisenhower and his group of commanders, in a place that the Arabs called Gibraltar, Gibraltar. And in that place, you think of it as the rock. It's not a rock. It's a hollow. There is room in the Gibraltar for 2,000 men to sleep. And so we locate there, and then we cross over. We have an operation, and we land in, of all places, Morocco. Now, this is not going to impress many people because there's nothing in Gibraltar and there's nothing in Morocco. But therefore, we're going to land there and we're going to do battle there. And George Patton is going to be one of those strange Americans that come. And so we land there, and then we move on into Tunisia, another French colony. Nobody is there. And then we move into Algeria. And in this process, the Afrika Corps is in a quandary now. Coming from one side of Africa is Patton and the Americans, and coming from the other side is Montgomery, General Montgomery, the British general. And they're coming from two different sides, and it looks like things are up for. And so the Battle of the Sand is given up because the last thing Hitler wants, he doesn't know anything about Africa anyway, is to lose a field marshal. So he orders what he can get of the Afrika Korps out, and Rommel in particular out, and the battle is over. So you have a second series of battles, all add up to the Battle of the Sand. Now, during this long time, long in some people's mind, the people who were divvying up Europe were Stalin and Hitler. They had signed a non-aggression pact. They took half of Poland each, so Poland disappeared again. And nothing seemed to be happening on the Western Front. And then suddenly General von Manstein, who realized that Hitler didn't have a plan for conquering France, came up with his own plan. There is in the French area a very series of special, shall we call it, citadel cities, Sedan, Verdun, and it was assumed by the German generals when they looked that Hitler planned to do what he had done when he was a corporal. That is, they were to invade France through Belgium. And von Manstein shook his head and said, no, we won't. He instead found the hills near Verdun, the mountain areas conducive to armored warfare. And so he cut through the Ardennes and was able to cut behind the French lines. And within a matter of weeks, France collapsed and the war was effectively over. The Germans agreed to take northern France and call it occupied France. And they put a general in charge, General von Rundstedt. And then for the south of France, there was an area called Vichy, which is a resort town. And that area would be unoccupied and run by the French, but run very carefully under the watchful eye of the Germans. So now you suddenly have this terrible situation where if anybody had told you, you would never believe that Hitler would double-cross Stalin. But he's occupied France, he's gone to Paris, he's signed, he's happy with the results. And suddenly, without any warning whatsoever, we have the second great battle, the Battle of the Snow, which will be the battle to knock Russia out of the war. Now, you might think that that's not possible. Let me tell you that General Marshall, the chief military advisor of President Franklin Roosevelt, told him in the worst days of the early war that it was likely that the United States would lose World War II. So while you know how the war ended, nobody in 1942 knew how the war was going to end. And things were looking badly and now you have the Wehrmacht, the German High Command, in three major areas. In the north, racing towards Leningrad. In the south, first in the north, racing towards Leningrad, then in the middle, racing towards Moscow, and then in the south, racing to the Stalingrad areas in the Crimea. So what to do about this? Well, Stalin was taken aback He had not planned on being betrayed, and now he was betrayed, and he had to fall back all the way beyond Moscow. And it looked really bleak. And obviously, people were thinking, well, still the Americans haven't really put in an oar. The Poles have now been destroyed. What has survived of the Polish military has gone off to the Middle East to fight with the British. And the likelihood of us losing was very real. But it wasn't to happen. The Russians regrouped. They lived for a year. They withdrew from Leningrad slowly. Leningrad is backed up by a lake, Lake Lodika. It freezes in the wintertime, so everybody was extracted who could be. And then the people, 1 million died, 1 million were extracted across the lake, and 1 million lived by eating the wallpaper off the palace walls of the great palaces in Leningrad. Terrible, terrible, terrible fate for these people. In fact, a very funny little story I'll tell you. There was a guy in Leningrad who composed a major symphony, the Leningrad, and he got it out of Leningrad on the lake. And there was an Italian living in New York City named Toscanini. And Toscanini heard all the way around the world about this famous symphony, the Leningrad, and he wanted to get it, and he got it. Somehow they found a plane that flew the plane from Moscow down to Odessa, then over to Tehran in Iran, and then all the way across to Egypt, and then to Egypt to a French colony on the coast of Africa in Senegal, and then from there over to the hump of South America, and then up and ending in something called, it's funny that we think of it as Kennedy today, an airport called Idlewild. And at the Idlewild airport was Toscanini, this little Italian guy. And he got the manuscript, got it back to New York, got the parts written out. And later that week, as war was still raging, the Leningrad Symphony was played to a New York audience to try and feel the pulse of the nation as things were looking bleak and bleaker. But this last thing on the Eurasian side was the Battle of the Snow. And it was Stalingrad, and the Russians decided to make a stand. And they did. And they won in the Battle of the Snow. And then suddenly it became the American time to do something. And one of the things we had to do was the Battle of the Sea. And when you mean the Battle of the Sea in World War II, you mean the submarines, the wolf packs of Grand Admiral Donitz. And it was quite a battle, but we won. Finally, we destroyed enough of the wolf packs that there was very little left in the way they tried constantly to improve. Towards the end of the war, they built a better submarine, one that could take and by various means stay submerged long periods of time. Otherwise, the Wolfpack is basically a series of maybe 8 submarines in a line, somewhere either on the gaps near Greenland, and they're waiting for the American convoys. And when they come, they sink, a huge number of them. And so this has to cease. And a lot of work is put into making it possible to, we had, the British did most of the work. You have to give them credit for that. They invented something called ASDIC, we call ASDIC sonar. And so now you could ping away and you could hear when you had a submarine nearby, and you could try and force it to the surface or simply sink it. And we did a number of those operations until finally Dönitz was out of patience and out of time. He'd already watched the foolishness of Hitler sending one capital ship, the Bismarck. The Bismarck came out of the far Baltic and cut around Scotland, and the British Admiralty was determined to sink it. So all efforts went into sinking that. But that wasn't an important part of the 5-phase battle. It was only one of the many, and in fact, we did sink it. We accidentally, it was coming into the French coast, trying to get under the Luftwaffe cover, and a screw somehow turned and caught, and it started circling. And then it was its death knell. And you can go over the Bismarck. I've gone over it several times, and it's in fairly shallow water. And with that, that was the end of any surface navy for the Germans. And now they were stuck with what was left of their so-called battle fleet, which they hid away in the Heligoland so that it could stay protected by the Luftwaffe and the air cover. But we had this amazing battle of the sea, and there we came into our own. You see that by the time we were in the war, we were in a 2-ocean war. We're just covering VE, Victory in Europe Day, but we had a 2-ocean war, and there was another war going on in dear old Pacific. And so how to get this done, how to share, because Churchill had insisted and Roosevelt had agreed that the war in Europe would come first and the war in the Pacific would come last. Now that's easier said than done, because the man who was in charge of the war in the Pacific was no less than Douglas MacArthur, a 5-star admiral, 5-star general in his case, working with a 5-star Admiral Halsey. And their problems were immense, and they were not getting the kind of cooperation they thought they needed, because Churchill, again, weighing in on the question, wanted the war in Europe to come first and then the war in Europe to come second. So you have this battle that's going on. The Battle of the Snow, of course, is the Battle of Stalingrad and the effort to keep the Allies afloat. The Battle of the Sea is the battle that we have to get rid of the U-boats so that we can have Roosevelt used to call it a bridge of ships. He was going to build a bridge of ships from the Atlantic side, our side, all the way to the European side. And it was on these ships that all the supplies are going to come to our ally Britain, and then to go to our ally, the Soviet Union, which meant going north of Scotland all the way around Norway. Remember, Norway has been betrayed by Quisling. So Norway has been taken over without a fight by the Germans. So all the way up to the Arctic Circle, there is a problem of getting supplies to the two ports that are open, and they are Murmansk and Archangel. But those are reached and supplies are sent. And you couldn't get enough because the more you sent, the more they needed in order to fight the war on their terms and to come against Germany from their side, because once Germany had betrayed them, they were solidly on the Allied side. And so there was the US, the UK, and the USSR. And it was a difficult time for all three because they had different ambitions. Britain wanted to have the empire survive. America wanted free trade. And in the case of the Soviet Union, they wanted a safe and secure homeland that meant moving the borders of Europe forward by hundreds and hundreds of miles. Certain parts of Europe were to be destroyed. The great land that was the German land of Prussia was to disappear. Königsberg, the great city of Immanuel Kant, was to be gone. Stalin planned to move all the Germans out of Prussia, East Prussia, and put in their place native white Russians. And he did it. And so they were obliterated. Even the street signs were changed. Königsberg is now Kaliningrad. The whole picture is part of something different. Not that it bothered us, because it wasn't part of the heritage that America understood, but Germany understood that they had lost a historic territory, this territory of East Prussia, forever. So we continue with our story. The raging tide of Prussia coming against the tide that was there. Now, there were a few other places, but they don't add up to the same kind of shock treatment that the Battle of the Sky, the Battle of the Sand, the Battle of the Snow, the Battle of the Sea. And then, once you get all this stuff done, and what you've got basically is England has been turned into, or Britain if you prefer, a floating aircraft carrier, because all this supply that's going to go and be the battle of the shore, the battle that gives us Normandy, will be very difficult to maneuver. To begin with, Hitler, of course, complete idiot, very typical, a corporal in World War I, and now a Führer without any sense of the occasion that he's caused a two-front war for Germany. She has war with Russia on one front and war with Britain on one front, and soon war with the United States on the same front that Britain's on, so that we can crush her from both sides. And so this period of time sees a buildup that's amazing. You can't move. Eisenhower moves his headquarters for Overlord to Belgravia. It's a very elegant area of London. And it's so loaded down with Americans that the British people refer to it as Eisenhower plots, that all you see are Yanks, because that's what there is. 1 million Americans in Britain preparing for Operation Overlord, and no one knowing whether it'll work. Many feeling that while there are some idiots in the German high command, von Rundstedt is not one of them. He is the Oberkommandeur West, the commander of Wehrmacht forces in Western Europe. And he has helping him now the man who has come back from the Afrika Corps, and you have von Rommel. So you are tripping on field marshals of the first order of magnitude. Now, you don't have the greatest of them all, because that's von Manstein. And von Manstein is trying desperately to hold together the other front, the Russian front. And he has a very hard time of it, because Hitler says there shall be no withdrawal. And there's no way to keep this famous front together unless you do withdraw. You have a retrograde. In other words, it's not a chaotic withdrawal. It is a typical German military plan to withdraw forces in such an orderly way that you can get behind a river line. There are all kinds of river lines. The Elbe River Line, the Vistula River Line, river lines that you can then put on the defensive. And von Manstein tries this, and Hitler explodes and fires him, his best general. So the issues are how to get the Americans on the landscape of Europe. Normandy is a very tricky story. To begin, it has a floodplain. That means that the tide goes way, way out, and it can race a human being back, so that if you're not careful and you go far out, you can't run fast enough, and if you can't swim, you'll drown. So this is a tricky maneuver to get tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, then 1 million men on the floodplain of Normandy. And we do it. The Battle of the Shore is won, but it is not an easy battle. We take 2 airborne divisions, that's 18,000 forces. We bring them over early. So you have an airborne, 101st and an 82nd Airborne, that are going to land in gliders way inside of Normandy to try and take strategic road links and other places that people would be trying to join up. You realize that once you come ashore, and the German High Command now knows, although Hitler still doesn't believe on the first day of Normandy, that that's the real landing. So he holds back the critical key force that could have helped win the day for the Germans in Normandy. He keeps back the Panzer divisions up in Calais because he's determined that the Americans will land there, and they don't land. So again, you're dealing with you don't want to always call him a nincompoop, but he is a nincompoop. You're dealing with Herr Hitler. And so we make the famous landing. The bombardment is unbelievable. Every ship that can fire is at Normandy and firing constantly. The beach, Normandy, I don't know if you know it or not, it's a wonderful, wonderful place. And it has lots of things to attract you to. There's a famous movie, A Man and a Woman, with Anouk Aimée. It's a French team. It's a very popular movie in the 60s. All of this takes place in Cherbourg to the areas of the Norman Peninsula. So the bombardment is lifted slowly so that as the first wave comes on the shore, the bombardment lifts and then lifts further and then lifts further. And now the huge battleships are firing far inland because the landing craft, the critical item that will carry men and supplies, are on their way to the battle of the shore. And they get up on the shore and there's great confusion. And it seems all so wonderful later. And you see all these movies and it ain't so wonderful when it's happening. And in fact, General Omar Bradley almost called the operation off because there were so many casualties in the first wave of landing craft as they came up in unbelievable places to Pont-de-Hoc, which was a bastion controlled by the Germans. Even further back, there are places still in Normandy where you can go. All the church windows were blown out, but the church stood. And so after the battle was over and the Battle of France was on, the people of Normandy paid a tribute to the 82nd Airborne by putting in airborne troops in the stained glass windows. So now here you have these wonderful stained glass windows that date from the time of William the Conqueror, 1066, and they are destroyed. And now the Norman people bring it back. And the building is intact, but what isn't intact is the stained glass window. And so they put those windows in as a tribute to the American soldiers who had to fight that day to get ashore. And so the Battle of the Shore was successful. We had a very funny group of people running our country at the time. All Roosevelt wanted was no casualties. And he was coming up for election, remember, and casualties really matter in an American campaign. And so he wanted low casualties. He also wanted us to be, shall we say, generous with the French. The French landed a division, that's, let's say, 20,000. And they, General Leclerc was the commanding officer. And the Americans, with the British understanding it was a very necessary item, the French were allowed to go ahead and liberate Paris. Unless you know Paris, you wouldn't think that's important. For Eisenhower, it was very important that we not liberate any cities at all, that we weren't there to liberate cities. We were there to overrun Germany. And that's what he set about to do. And so the Battle of the Shore came to a successful conclusion. It's a very difficult area of terrain. The hedgerows, which means that you have rows that grow up on either side, and then the road is down like this, so you don't know what's going on except the road ahead and the road behind. And the hedgerows are huge. And so until you could break open to the open countryside of France, and then you yourself could use what we were not very good at, but we tried our best. Armored warfare. We could use our version of panzers. Our panzers were called Grant tanks and Sherman tanks. And they weren't anywhere near as good, but they were so many more of them because the one thing we had was lots of stuff. And so we just flooded the plain of France with these in an attempt to race to the Rhine, to find wouldn't it be wonderful to find a bridge? You'd never find a real bridge, but maybe you'd find a railroad bridge across the Rhine, and they did. The bridge at Remagen. So suddenly, American troops were up on the Rhine and were crossing the Rhine, and were able, therefore, to put forces in Germany that the Germans didn't think would be there. The Germans are going to try one last attempt. It's Christmas time. Famous stories about all the Americans and all the Germans coming out and not firing that day and instead singing Christmas carols. Well, that's not a high point of the war. The high point of the war was the Germans put everything they had left into an attempt to split the British and the American forces in a very famous Operation Market Garden, and they almost succeeded. There was a very famous American general who was confronted by his German peer, and he was told to surrender, that the jig was up. And the American general said, "Nuts, I'm not surrendering." And he didn't. Patton put himself into this battle too. Patton was an extremely controversial, and we would have been better off without him. But we were with him. He had already slapped a soldier who was suffering from terrible shell shock. And he had been reprimanded by Eisenhower himself, told that he was personally, as a general officer of the United States Army, to apologize to all the people that were there when the incident occurred. And he did. So it wasn't all lightness on our side either. There were complications. There were people worried about things. What would they be worried about? Well, there was this crazy, as always, Berkeley professor, and he was going to split the atom out in Alamogordo. Where the hell is Alamogordo, and what the hell is it? Has to do with the fact that Einstein had told Franklin Roosevelt it was possible to have an atomic bomb, and we should get it before the Germans. We also tried to get lots of things before them. Do you know that they developed jet aircraft in the end of World War II? So things were very dicey, very, very dicey. And yet, with our man in Berkeley, we did develop a atom bomb, handmade, only two of them, big boy and little boy. There were no more. These don't come off the shopping shelf. They are handmade and very touchy. Believe me, you don't want to be around them. So we're doing all of that. We're getting the bridge at Remagen. We've gotten the timeline is set now for likely being able to complete the war. That's all that Roosevelt was interested in, was the war to be ended. And of course, he didn't live to see that. He died in Warm Springs of the polio that had racked his body. Mrs. Roosevelt got the word in the White House. She called Harry Truman, who was playing poker in the Senate. He was told to come immediately to the White House. He came. She said, "Good afternoon, Mr. President." And he knew nothing. He knew nothing at all about the war. Roosevelt was many things, but he was not a good person to keep others informed. And so he had to catch up soon. He was going to go off to Potsdam to a Big Three conference. And it was going to be really odd because the only original was Stalin, because the British people in their great wisdom had decided to de-elect Churchill. So there was a new Labor prime minister. He didn't know anything either. Truman and Attlee facing Stalin at Potsdam. So all of these things bring off a certain kind of, we tried as best we could. Truman did not trust Stalin upon second meeting. And it went badly from then on because Stalin was interested only in moving the Russian border all the way to Central Europe. And all the great capitals of Central Europe were to be Soviet satellites. Budapest, Prague, Warsaw. And the Cold War began. Churchill, out of office, came to Missouri, of all places, and gave a very famous speech and said, "A iron curtain has fallen across the ancient capitals of Europe." And it had. So, nevertheless, the young Navy guy in New York City, when he was told that it was Victory in Europe Day, he grabbed a woman and gave her a famous kiss, and the war came to an end. That war, to be followed in 2 years with the Cold War. And in the meantime, there was still VJ Day. We had to beat the Japanese, and they were not going to be easy. They had taken their time. They thought that there was a definite pattern to American, and the pattern was we were basically lazy and bored with war. We wanted out of the war as fast as possible. And they had built a ring of steel from Tokyo across the Pacific so that all these bastions, Iwo Jima is not just a rock, it's a major battle. Or Guadalcanal, you can list them on and on. And they all have to be fought all the way until that day where at least you can say this for the Berkeley professor. He had hoped that the atom bomb would not be used against human beings. He'd hoped that it would be used on an isolated island so that it would be a demonstration of this amazing power, but no human being. Well, not everybody felt that way. And certainly Harry Truman didn't feel that way. And huge numbers of Americans didn't feel that way because they were on the island of Okinawa preparing for the mainland invasion, which would have cost hundreds upon thousands upon thousands upon thousands of American casualties. The Japanese are going to fight to the last human being. They continued to fight on isolated islands where they had been left behind. Let me give you an example. We knew that there was 50,000 Japanese troops on Rabaul. So what did we do? Did we fight? Heavens no. Who wants to fight 50,000 die-hard Japanese? We just skipped them. We skipped that island, went over it, and finally they were left behind. There were so many Japanese on that island, still waiting for the war to fight, and the war had ended. There were people who 10 years after the war came out of the jungle on these islands like Saipan and wondered where everybody was, and only then knew that the war was over and Japan had lost. So Europe came to a close. VE Day was celebrated widely all over. In London, the town went crazy. In Paris, the town went crazy. Even in Rome, Mussolini now slaughtered by his own people. And Hitler, well, you know, it's still a rumor that Hitler's jawbone is in the Kremlin. For sure, Hitler's body was burnt outside of his wolf's lair. And so the war was over. And when we get back, we are still together, and I'm still able to talk. We'll cover how did we ever get across the Pacific? Good Lord, mile and mile of nothing. Well, it's called a series of very, very big battles Midway, one of them, Battle of the Philippines Sea, another. These are big aircraft carrier battles, and we will cover them all if I'm still living and you're still living and we've all taken our COVID. So thank you for listening this afternoon. And sorry my voice was a little rusty. Have a good day and get a good COVID.